tonight's Shia, tonight's Divrei Torah, and of course the Hesped Alei Nishmas, Rabbi Sachs, Rav Yaakov Tzvi ben Rav David Aryeh. I was fortunate to know Rabbi Sachs personally, but let me explain. Let me go back to where it all began, because for me it's been quite a journey. Every week for decades, really, I would go and visit my grandparents. My grandmother's still with us. She lives in Broughton Park. I've not been into her house since COVID started, really. But I'd go visit my grandparents and I'd spend time learning with my grandfather. Now, my grandfather, who I've mentioned many times in this year, was a solicitor. He never attended yeshiva, but he was self-taught. He was from Leeds, and he amassed a vast Jewish library, and he introduced me to hundreds of his books. My grandfather introduced me to Rav Kook, to Rav Soloveitchik, and there was a particular genre of books that my grandfather liked. And I quickly learned which books held zero interest to him. He wasn't interested in most modern books, especially the Likutim, the books that were just sort of like borrowing, stealing, he would say, from different authors, and there's sort of like a hodgepodge, sort of like patchwork quilt from all different people. He wasn't interested in those. Something that was just nice, Divrei Torah, that could be found in other original works, held no interest in my grandfather. Most of the time, my grandfather would be found learning Shalos HaTshuvos. So works, again, that we've quoted many times in our shiurim, things like Igros Moshe, Rav Moshe Feinstein, Minchas Yitzchok, Diane Weiss from Manchester, Tzitz Eliezer. Mostly, and he would always give me a history lesson on each of the authors. There were very few contemporary authors that my grandfather really liked. One of them was Rabbi Ovadia Yosef. He was obsessed with Rabbi Ovadia Yosef. So, needless to say, I was really surprised that my grandfather liked Rabbi Sachs so much, because other than Rabbi Ovadia Yosef and Rabbi Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, who were towering giants in the halachic world, it seemed that all of his books and all of his heroes were of previous generations. So the question that bothered me, and I asked him, was what was it about Rabbi Sachs? What was the appeal that Rabbi Sachs held, much more so than so many other great Torah leading giants? My grandfather, I don't recall him ever mentioning the works of Rav Shach, who was known in the Litvish non-Hasidic world as the greatest rabbi of his generation, the greatest Rosh Hashiva. But his works, Avnei Ha'azel, Evan Ha'azel, didn't appeal to my grandfather. What was it about Rabbi Sachs that appealed to so many people? I remember my grandfather being so excited when this came out, the Siddur, Rabbi Sachs Siddur. He went on about what an improvement it was to all the previous Singer's editions, Singer's prayer books. Now, this wasn't my grandfather's nusach, actually. It wasn't his exact nusach, but this is a siddur he used. He got it when it came out in 2006, and he proudly showed it to me. And the best bit, he would always say, was the introduction. He said the entire siddur was worth writing for the introduction. He says, you cannot properly understand prayer. I can hear my grandfather saying this years later. You cannot properly understand prayer without reading the introduction to the Rabbi Sachs siddur. And Rabbi Sachs' avoda, his tefillah, was certainly something that was very, very important to him. And I asked my grandfather, what made you buy it? It was so different from his regular books. His entire library, he had so few books in English. What made him buy this siddur? And he related the following, and I heard this a couple of times from my grandfather, and I put it on a family group last night, and an uncle called me from Israel, one of my mother's brothers. I had a great uncle, my grandmother's late brother, who was a rabbi in the East End called Rabbi Turetsky, Rabbi Moshe Turetsky. Rabbi Turetsky was, he taught as well in Jews College, and years ago, I'm probably talking about 40, 50 years ago now, my great uncle, Rabbi Turetsky, said to my late grandfather, he said, I've got one student who's a cut above the rest. He learns day and night, and I always see him hanging around in what's now LSJS library, in the Jews College library. Mark my words, he would say to my grandfather. My grandfather would repeat it to us, and my uncle heard, and we all heard this from him many, many times. Mark my words, something great is going to become of this man. This young man's called Jonathan Sachs. Remember his name, Rabbi Turetsky would say. Remember his name. He's so intelligent and devoted, a cut above the rest. And I must have been about 15, 16. And my grandfather said to me, he goes, "Here, read this." And he gave me a book. I'd heard of him, I'd heard of the author, but I didn't know much about him. And it was this: Will we have Jewish grandchildren? My grandfather knew that I wanted to work with the wider Jewish community. And he was really, really encouraging of that. I went to work for Aish for 3 years in Israel and 5 years in America. And this book, which was the first book I had, I owned of Rabbi Sachs. I now have about 30 of them, including the Machzorim and whatnot. This is the first book I had, and it blew me away. Rabbi Sachs, in this book, spoke of his own journey. He speaks about how he was moved during the 6-Day War, and he went exploring. He got on a coach, and he went around America. And he spoke about his meeting with a Hasidic Rebbe. He writes about this in this book. He doesn't mention who the Rebbe is, but anyone who's listened to Rabbi Sachs, he talks about this meeting many, many times. And he explains that he was talking, of course, about the Lubavitcher Rebbe. The Lubavitcher Rebbe encouraged him as a university student to really change his entire calling, so to speak. And Rabbi Sachs puts down his meeting with the Rebbe and also with Rabbi Soloveitchik, the same time he met with both of these Torah giants in America. And these two people inspired Rabbi Sachs to go on and to really make a difference. And I was hooked. I was a teenager in yeshiva, learning Gemara, but I was fascinated by his books. Somehow, Rabbi Sachs validated my quest, and I felt challenged and charged with a mission. It was validating everything I wanted to do. I felt like in this book that Rabbi Sachs was speaking to me, but I couldn't get a hold of any more of his books. Picture my naivety. I walked in. I went to Gateshead shortly after this, or thereabouts. Maybe I was in Gateshead already. I don't remember exactly, but walking into Gateshead, into Lehman's and the great big bookstore there, and I remember asking them if they had any more books by Chief Rabbi Sachs. He was Chief Rabbi at the time, and I asked them, "Have I got any books by Chief Rabbi Sachs?" And they couldn't say no quick enough. And I remember calling my grandfather. I call him all the time. And I said to him, "No, you can't buy Rabbi Sachs's books anywhere in Gateshead." This is before the days of Amazon, or certainly before I'd heard of Amazon and Aid Books and everywhere else that I buy books nowadays. And my grandfather laughed with me, and he patiently explained that Rabbi Sachs was encouraging people. I remember this is more or less the words he used, and I'm talking over 20 years later. He told me that Rabbi Sachs was encouraging people to take their noses out of their Gemaras and utilize their learning, utilize their passion for their religion to better the world around them. And then he said, not everyone in Gateshead is ready to hear that. I'll never forget those words. And he was right. That's what Rabbi Sachs was encouraging people to do. Rabbi Sachs, of course, was not against people studying Gemara. He wasn't against Chas v'Shalom people, studying in yeshiva and kollel, but he would challenge us. He would charge us as student rabbis and as a student teacher later on. What are you going to do with all that learning? What are you going to do with it? When I was next in Gateshead, my grandfather had another book waiting for me. When I next came home, my grandfather had another book, and it was this one. I want to read you a couple of extracts from it later. If time allows us. It's a fantastic book called One People, Tradition, Modernity and Jewish Unity. I think he actually wrote this one first. It's a absolutely fantastic book. If you read up about the book, you see that he changed some of it actually by challenges by some non-Orthodox members of clergy. An absolutely fascinating book, which I think is particularly relevant for his attitude towards halacha and just Jewish living on the whole. And I snuck this book back into Gateshead, And when I wasn't learning Gemara, which was quite a bit of time, I mastered these books. I read them both cover to cover on more than one time. And around that time, this was actually after this, Rabbi Sachs got into a bit of trouble. It was after the Hugo Grin affair. For those that aren't familiar, Rabbi Sachs refused to attend the funeral of a leading. Hugo Grin was a Holocaust survivor and a prominent Reform rabbi, and Rabbi Sachs didn't go to the funeral, and he was lambasted by the Jewish Chronicle and those on the left and outside the Orthodox camp. So then he attended a memorial session for him, and he got lambasted by the people on the right. So kind of like damned if you do, damned if you don't position. And following that, Rabbi Sachs came to Gateshead, and everyone wondered what would be. And my friends who knew that I was a fan, bit of a groupie actually, but my friends who knew that I was a fan were determined that there's no way they were going to let him into Gateshead Yeshiva. There's no way. And they were wrong. I will never forget my Rosh Yeshiva, Rabbi Gorovitz, inviting him not just to come and not just to stand at the front, but he stood him at Mizrach in Rav Matisyahu Salomon's seat. I mean, this was, the seat of seats. I mean, even the Rosh Yeshiva wouldn't sit in that seat. And he gave him the covered that he was due. And I was vindicated. And it was something very, very special. Later, there was another controversy. Sachs published a new book, The Dignity of Difference. I've only got the later edition. How to Avoid the Clash of Civilizations. And the central message of this book was that every religious community has equal parity in its attempt to find God. And he wrote, and I got a quote here, and this was the quote that got him into trouble. God has spoken to mankind in many languages, through Judaism to Jews, Christianity to Christians, Islam to Muslims. No one creed has a monopoly on spiritual truth. No one civilization encompasses all the spiritual, ethical, and artistic expressions of mankind. In heaven there is truth. On earth there are truths. God is greater than religion. He is only partially comprehended by any faith. Rabbi Rakov, the previous Gateshead Rav, and Rabbi Chazan here in Manchester were furious with this, because he gave the impression that Judaism does not have a monopoly on truth. And for me, watching this at the time, and I've read a few papers, I was fascinated not by what he wrote and not by the controversy, but by the fact that Rabbi Sachs backed down and apologized and rewrote it and republished the book. And that was extremely characteristic, because of all the moves that Rabbi Sachs did. Rabbi Sachs was an Ish Emes, and he was an Ish Shalom. He was a man of truth, and he was a man of peace. And he did what it took. I don't know which one Rabbi Sachs preferred, the original version of this book or the second version. It didn't matter, because Rabbi Sachs was the bigger person. And unlike politicians, let's say, without mentioning any particular names, for Rabbi Sachs, it wasn't about being right. It wasn't about winning. It was about shalom. And he was prepared to do what it took, even rewriting the books that he dedicated so much of his life to. He was prepared to do that if that's what the Dayanim of the London Beis Din told him to do. And he always consulted with them. And when you're in a man of that position, to listen to other people is just incredible. I remember the last time I met with him, and he asked me what I was working on. And I remember the conversation so clearly. It was a conversation in King David. It was last time he came. I spoke to him over the phone since, and I wrote him letters. And he was never too proud to listen to other people. It wasn't just about admitting when he made mistakes. It was his attitude towards, oh, well, maybe I do need to redo this. And there's so many of his books, whether it's One People or whether it's The Dignity of Difference, that he listened to people on the right and on the left, and he conceded and he rewrote them. Rabbi Sachs gave the impression of nobility. Rabbi Sachs was the ultimate ambassador for the Jewish people and for faith communities worldwide, but especially in England. We were all so proud to have Rabbi Sachs in the House of Lords. We were so proud every single time he came on Thought of the Day and he presented on the radio. But so we saw the noble side of him, but the human side of him was something. Rabbi Sachs was actually a quiet and shy person by nature. I'm convinced of that. Now I use Rabbi Sachs' siddur. This is the siddur I keep in my talis bag. It's the one I use during the week. I use his machzorim religiously. My wife bought me the siddur as soon as it came out. I reckon I may have been one of the first people in the States to have it. But I love the machzorim even more because Rabbi Sachs truly encapsulates the mood, the theme of the Chagim. The essay, and this is something that runs throughout. Art Scroll is magnificent. The Art Scroll translation is wondrous. But Rabbi Sachs somehow improved that. If you want to understand the mood, the ambiance, I'm going to say, of the Yom Tovim, then in our speech, in modern 2020 language, I don't think you'll find anything that comes close to the language of Rabbi Sachs. I don't think of Rabbi Sachs as a poet and as an artist, but somehow when it comes to the way he explains Shir Hashirim, the way he explains these things in the way that Art Scroll wouldn't dare, the honesty that Rabbi Sachs brings to his writing about Judaism is so refreshing that you can't go back. You can't go back to using Art Scroll again. I use them. I use these religiously to enhance my own davening. But aside from his writing, aside from a master educator, as I was saying, he was the ultimate ambassador for Judaism. I have religious Christian colleagues at work, English teachers. They usually teach English, right? The religious Christians, for somehow or other, end up in the English department, and I've lent them books. Whether it's his latest book, Morality, or some of his earlier books, if you're looking for common ground to share with faith communities, or someone who can properly represent the Jewish community and faith communities, there is no one better who represents us in the English-speaking world. Of course, the chief rabbi, Rabbi Sachs, was not the first chief rabbi to be a lord in the House of Lords. Lord Jacobovitz before him was, but his inreach and his outreach are unparalleled. And I asked myself, how did one person accomplish so much? How did one person, and it's not just about writing his books, it's not just about, every single year since he was chief rabbi, the 23 years bringing out another book, but how did one person accomplish so much? And I don't believe it's because he was so brilliant, so gifted, so talented, because I've met many brilliant, highly educated men and women across my travels, and none of them accomplished a fraction of what Rabbi Sachs did. What did Rabbi Sachs have that others didn't, that others don't? And I believe, and I've long believed, that Rabbi Sachs accomplished so much because he cared so much. That's it. I'm going to put Rabbi Sachs up there with Rabbi Noach Weinberg and the Lubavitcher Rebbe as people who cared more than anybody else in our generation about Am Yisrael and about humanity. I've never, to have that connection with, to care so much. And that is why Rabbi Sachs was so dedicated. That's why Rabbi Sachs was so dedicated to the British community, to the Rabbanim. And for someone who gave such a standoffish impression, for someone who stood up on the stage and was so polished and so regal and royal with every single presentation he gave, for someone who had that persona and who came across like that, so polished in every single and so measured, you thought, well, he's up there. Yet Rabbi Sachs was surprisingly accessible. Surprisingly accessible. And that's something, I mean, I would write to him and I'd get these lovely handwritten responses. And again, every single one of them, and then these are letters that I treasure, and they're personal letters, and they were all they weren't just, the regular thank you letter for writing me. These weren't just, I'll have my secretary write to you. This is someone who took the time to care. And, the fact that he remembered my first name in speaking to me, and this wasn't, one of his bodyguards had told them. This was someone who genuinely cared. I was reading yesterday about Rabbi student, what a name. Right, there's a Rabbi Gil student who runs a wonderful, it was a blog and now it's a website called Torah Musings. And he was writing about his reflections on the time when he got to walk Rabbi Sachs up. It was literally a few seconds. And Rabbi Sachs had said to him, so you're the Gil student? And Rabbi Sachs was talking about how he admires Rabbi students' writings. And it was a new side of me. And I'm just trying to picture sort of Rabbi Sachs going online and going to read a junior rabbi in comparison, reading his writings, reading a younger rabbi's writings who's not a deep philosopher. These aren't the Kants and the Spinozas, and we only think of Rabbi Sachs as sort of like reading the classics. And when we realized that Rabbi Sachs was so well read and he cared and he wanted to know what was going on. He wanted to know about the trends. He wanted to know about other books that were coming out. Rabbi Sachs cared about the modern Sepharim and the modern English books that were coming out, and to read them, to know about them, but not just to know about the writings, but to know about the authors. And when he met them, he had not just the kindest word, but you could see that this was someone who genuinely cared. And that is how Rabbi Sachs accomplished so much. Forgive me for repeating a Devar Torah, which you may have heard if you listened to the eulogies that were delivered at the Levaya. Dayan Binstock repeated the Devar Torah from Rabbi Sachs that he said over, the Rabbi Sachs had said over, and it was so appropriate. I remember hearing this from Rabbi Sachs. I mean, Rabbi Sachs can read a phone book and sound eloquent and make it sound meaningful. I've just done this Chumash with my daughter. It was a homework, and as I'm doing the Chumash, I'm thinking, I'm hearing these echoes of Rabbi Sachs' Devar Torah, Rabbi Sachs' unique take on this Chumash. So it's the story of Sodom. The story of Sodom, where Abraham campaigns on behalf of the people of Sodom. Not because his nephew Lot and his wife and family live there, nothing to do with that. It's because Abraham cares for humanity. And Abraham starts off and he says, there's 5 cities. Olay yesh 50 tzadikim. Maybe there's 50 tzadikim. And Hashem says, if there were 50 tzadikim, I'd save the 5 cities. And Abraham realizes, there aren't. There are not 10 tzadikim for each of these cities. So Abraham bargains and he says, okay, maybe there's 45 tzadikim. And sorry, someone's mute them. Maybe there's 45 tzadikim. And Hashem says, I'm sorry, there aren't. And Rabbi Sachs said, it's not that he's caring about one city less. He's saying maybe there's 9 tzadikim per city. And then he goes down from 50 to 40 to 30, goes down. And eventually he goes down to 10. He says, maybe there's 10 righteous people among these 5 cities. That's 2 people per city, 2 tzaddikim per city. Abraham genuinely believed that if there were 10 tzaddikim per city, that possibly HaKadosh Baruch Hu could spare these 5 cities. And Abraham is begging on behalf of these 5 cities. Maybe there's 10 tzaddikim, maybe there's 2 righteous people per city. And Hashem says, I'm sorry. There aren't. There aren't 10 people with the redeeming qualities. And that's it. That's the end of the negotiations. He doesn't carry on bartering. He doesn't carry on pleading. And Rabbi Sachs asked the obvious question, why not? Why does he stop at 10? Maybe there's 5 tzaddikim. Maybe there's 1 tzaddik per city. And Rabbi Sachs said, that's not possible. It's not possible that there was just 1 tzaddik per city. Because to be a tzaddik means that you have to have influenced another person. You cannot be a tzaddik, to be a righteous person, and sit in your ivory tower and not care and not have influenced other people. You can't be a tzaddik in a vacuum. And I think that Devar Torah, which Dan Binstock repeated over, I think is something that encapsulated Rabbi Sachs so much. And it goes back to those wise words that my grandfather said about why there were no Rabbi Sachs books available 25 years ago, for 20 odd years ago, for sale in layman's. Because Rabbi Sachs encouraged people to leave the Gemara and to apply that and to use it to influence other people beyond the Orthodox community and beyond the Jewish community. I believe that Rabbi Sachs saw himself in some ways as a modern day Avraham. Unlike the Lubavitcher Rebbe, who cared beyond the Lubavitch community, beyond the Orthodox community, and beyond the Jewish community, I think Rabbi Sachs felt the same way. This is my well-used Haggadah that I use every year, the Rabbi Sachs Haggadah. I remember asking, this for a while this was out of print. It's been redone since by Koren, and I cannot recommend it enough. I'm on commission. And I remember speaking to Rabbi Sachs, and this is in LSJS, and I said to him, there's a couple of your books that are out of print. I said, the Haggadah, I said, that's got to be, it's your best. This was before the Machzerim came out, but the Haggadah is something else. And it's, I must say, I've taken inspiration for this from my future book. It's got two front covers. It opens as an English book on one side and a Haggadah from the other. They meet halfway, the Haggadah and the book. And allow me to read you a brief quote from the Haggadah. Right, so Rabbi Sachs, it's a theme that runs throughout the Haggadah, of the Haggadah being education night. Significantly, Sachs writes, in the only place where the Torah explains why Abraham was chosen to carry the promise of the covenant, the reason is given in terms of parenthood. For, quoting the Pasuk, for I have chosen him so that he will instruct his children and his household after him, that they may keep the way of the Lord, doing what is right and just. Abraham was chosen in order to be a parent. He was also chosen to be an educator. The two concepts, so different in many societies, including our own, are in Judaism inseparable. If there's one theme that carried Rabbi Sachs throughout, it was his modern take on Masorah, not as we normally translate it as tradition, but it was about handing over the flame. It was not tradition, but it was the importance of education. I don't think Rabbi Sachs's legacy is primarily his Siddur, his Haggadah, his Machzorim, his books, his radio shows. I don't think it's any of that. I think Rabbi Sachs's legacy outshines all of that. I think Rabbi Sachs's legacy is the neshama and how much he cared for us, for the community, for Israel, and indeed for all of humanity, and then the difference he made to Jewish schools. The amount of people in King David, the amount of people in schools across the UK, the percentage of Jewish children that are now getting a Jewish education. I think we owe more to Lord Sachs, to Rabbi Sachs, more than anybody else. He made it his priority, and he shifted the United Synagogue mentality. And he stressed this over and over throughout all of his writings, throughout all of his teachings, that there is nothing more important than education. This was one of Judaism's greatest achievements through the ages. The Hebrew word for male, zachar, is closely related to the word for memory, zachar, remember. It is a task of fathers to hand on to their children the memories of the past. For we are related to the past not just biologically, but also culturally, through the stories we tell and the history we relate. This is what we do on Pesach. And if that sounds familiar, it's because it came out throughout so many of Rabbi Sachs's works. I don't think Rabbi Sachs strived to be an Eliyahu Hanavi. He certainly didn't strive to be the zealot of Eliyahu and of Pinchas. I think Rabbi Sachs strived to be an Avraham. where it was all about passing it on to the next generation. And as Rabbi Sachs stresses over and over, that is why he was chosen. The legacy is not just about the schools that he created, but the stress and the importance that we have on Masorah, on passing it down. I put together here so many different quotes which I wanted to read out from Rabbi Sachs, but I don't think it's just about what he wrote. I think it's about the caring attitude, the neshama that he shared with everyone. Rabbi Sachs was not just an ambassador for the Jewish people. Rabbi Sachs was not just an ambassador for faith communities. Rabbi Sachs was not just the most prolific author of our times, even producing books that are more popular even than Nadine Steinsaltz in the Jewish community. But Rabbi Sachs was someone who genuinely cared about everyone and brought out the best in Anglo Jewry. Rabbi Sachs revitalized, breathed a soul into the United Synagogue, which was a dying institution, where other people, other Rabbonim didn't want to know, didn't care, or didn't feel that they could make a difference. The Rabbi Sachs, the challenge that he continues to leave us, the mission that he continues to leave us is to educate, is to care, is to pass down the Masorah, to think about the next generation and how we can make a difference. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Cohen. Thank you so much for sharing your personal reflections, your deep, heartfelt words. I can really feel it through the screen, what a huge impact he had on your life and, countless lives around us. Yes, today, the burial and the Shabbos, his death is just, these past few days have been very, very sad. A huge loss. So thank you so much tonight for coming to share your words that are menachem, and hopefully we will just find that nechama in the different corners, the different pieces of light that he gave out to the world. So we're going to resume the first shir and come back for the second shir at 8:45. So feel free to stay, to leave, and see you soon.
Thank you.